would say not original, but let's see. It's pretty long, but not with Phyllis, not as early as Phyllis. Oh my Lord! No, this is nice. Or no, I don't know. Yeah, I think, well, I don't know, it doesn't say, it didn't say.
Folks, I'm going to ask you to please take your seats at this time. Services are about to begin. You'll have to pray for your family and Shiva. Folks, I'm going to ask you to please take your seats. Please have a seat. Thank you very much. Folks, please take your seats in the chapel.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, as we pay tribute to Frank and to the Maris family in support and love. Thank you all for being here. One of the ways that we are going to honor Frank for in his many accomplishments is when he has served our country, and I now call upon members of the United States Navy to come and pay honors to him and to the family.
Served in U.S. military We'll begin today's memorial service with a reading from Psalm 15. Who is worthy to be counted among the extraordinary? One who lives with integrity, does what is right, and recognizes the truth. Whose tongue utters no slander, who does others no evil, but cherishes others who behave honorably. Unwavering, this person will keep a promise even at personal expense and will never lend money with ruthless intent or take a bribe to harm the innocent. Whoever lives this way will be remembered always. Now a reading from Albert Einstein. Strange is our situation here upon earth. Each of us comes for a short visit, not knowing why, yet sometimes seeming to divine a purpose. From the standpoint of daily life, however, there is one thing we do know, that we are here for the sake of each other. Above all, for those upon whose smile and well-being our own happiness depends. And also for the countless unknown souls with whose fate we are connected by a bond of sympathy. Many times a day, I realize how much my outer and inner life is built upon the labors of others, both living and dead, and how earnestly I must exert myself in order to give in return as much as I have received and am still receiving. We are gathered here today for the purpose of mourning, honoring, and celebrating the life of Frank Maris. May his memory be for a blessing. There is a teaching from the early 20th century German Jewish philosopher Martin Buber that speaks to the bittersweet nature of this moment in its affirmation of the absolute distinctiveness and preciousness of each human life. He wrote, "Every person born into the world represents something new, something that never existed before, something original and unique. If there had been someone like him in the world, there would have been no need for him to be born." While many may affirm this reality in the abstract, it is so often the case that we feel this truth in a more powerful way than ever before after a loved one has left this world. At such a time, we contend with an absence in the unique shape of the space that this person occupied, certainly in all of our lives, but also in the world more broadly. The central purpose of gathering in the way that we are this afternoon is to lift up that sense of uniqueness that Frank brought to the world, and to strengthen one another in the lifelong pursuit of weaving his singular spirit and memory into our hearts. We will approach that purpose from two perspectives today. I will begin with an overview of Frank's life, gleaned from conversation with his family and from the memories of several members of the Kohellev community. And this will be followed by reflections from Frank and Phyllis's daughter, Lisa, offering thoughts on Frank's legacy from her own unique perspective. Frank Maris was born into a family of modest means in Elizabeth, New Jersey on July 16, 1941. His father, Walter, and his mother, Nancy, had met one another in Chicago, where each of their itinerant jobs happened to have temporarily taken them. Nancy was working for the Salvation Army, and Walter earned his living as a traveling knife sharpener. After their wedding, Frank's parents moved to New Jersey, where they both had relatives, aiming to settle down and raise a family. Frank had an older half-brother who was born to his mother from a previous marriage, but Frank was the oldest of 3 children born to Walter and Nancy. Frank lived through many challenges in his family life during his early years. His father was a good person, but emotionally unpredictable, which created a sense of instability and uncertainty in Frank's life. When Frank was 8 years old, his mother died unexpectedly, which was an enormous shock and extremely traumatic for the entire family. His father, who was not the most reliable parent before this occurred, was not really able initially to provide the level of support and nurture that his children needed. So Frank and his brothers were moved to an orphanage while his sister was taken in by another family member. Eventually, Frank and his siblings were reunited with their father, and it was that setting in which Frank spent his late childhood and adolescent years. Frank was from early on very bright, especially gifted in math. His academic abilities helped him get accepted into the University of Pennsylvania, and receiving a Navy ROTC scholarship provided him the financial resources for tuition and to support himself while studying there. It was during these years that he first met Phyllis, who would become the love of his life. At the time, Phyllis was taking a leave from her college studies and was working and living on the UPenn campus. An old boyfriend of hers named Peter invited her to attend a party at his fraternity, and it just so happened to be the same fraternity that Frank belonged to. Phyllis recalls that there was a moment when she really wanted to step outside for a cigarette, and as fate would have it, Peter did not have any cigarettes with him that night, but Frank did. That evening, Frank and Phyllis had the first of many open-hearted and meaningful conversations and started building a connection that would eventually lead them to make a lifelong commitment to one another. Phyllis was very taken with Frank's clear capacity for empathy and kindness, his ability to listen and be present, as well as his comfort with deep and authentic communication. But after 6 months of dating, it seemed that their lives were on very different trajectories, so they ended that phase of their relationship. Later that same year, Phyllis's family moved to Cleveland for her father to take a faculty position at Case Institute of Technology, and Phyllis decided to go with them and complete the remaining years of her undergraduate studies at Western Reserve University. Meanwhile, Frank remained in Philadelphia for the next 2 years and graduated with a degree in economics. That's good. He then had to fulfill his 4-year commitment to the Navy and was able to enlist as an officer because of his ROTC training. During the 6-year period, despite having officially exited from their status as romantic partners, and despite living far from one another for an extended period of time, they remained good friends and kept in touch with each other with letters consistently being sent back and forth. Upon completing his military service, Frank's first stop was back with his family in New Jersey. But soon thereafter, he felt ready to proceed with the next step on his career path, so he applied and was accepted to a doctoral program in economics at Purdue University. He knew that driving out to Purdue from New Jersey, it would not be too far out of the way to make a stop in Cleveland to see his old flame, Phyllis. That visit and the very positive reconnection they experienced in the process is what truly cemented their relationship and set them on the road towards making a life together. They continued to see a lot of each other as Frank began his studies at Purdue. Phyllis would frequently visit West Lafayette, and Frank would come to Cleveland at every opportunity. At a certain point, however, Frank realized that a lifelong career as an economist was not as appealing to him as he had anticipated it would be. So he made the decision in the spring of 1967 to leave the program, having completed the courses required to obtain a master's degree. This change in direction allowed him to take the step of moving to Cleveland, which in turn brought marriage to Phyllis that much closer. He was ready to take the step of introducing Phyllis to two of his closest friends, Oscar and Catherine, to get their approval. It didn't take long after that for wedding plans to start taking shape. Frank and Phyllis were married on October 5th, 1969. While on the surface their marriage appeared to follow the traditional gender role contours, with Frank serving as the main breadwinner and Phyllis taking on more of the domestic responsibilities, in reality, they had a much more egalitarian partnership. Frank was always ready to help out, and Phyllis always knew that he saw all of their household responsibilities as shared. Another way that Frank demonstrated his commitment to being Phyllis's partner was the tremendous amount of support he provided her when she was in the midst of giving birth to their oldest child, Lisa, in 1971. This was a role that plenty of men at that time were not willing to play. The arrival of Lisa in their lives, followed 2 years later by David in 1973, was a source of great joy for Frank and Phyllis. For Frank, parenthood and fatherhood held an especially poignant meaning because of the ways in which he felt his own father hadn't been the parent that Frank and his siblings needed. He had resolved to be a consistently supportive and loving presence in the lives of his children, and he was, in fact, able to fulfill that commitment. Friends of Lisa's that spent time at their house often commented on how lucky she and David were to have the kind of family they did, but especially to have the kind of father that Frank was. Frank's career path, once in Cleveland, at first followed the trajectory that was very much in line with his studies in college and graduate school. He worked for the city of Cleveland in the Department of Economic Development, which was followed by a position at the Greater Cleveland Growth Association, where he eventually became the director of research. After a number of years in that role, he was recruited by Forest City Enterprises, where he worked for a shorter amount of time. These were all successful endeavors for him, but his natural curiosity about life and his deep-seated desire to be helpful to people in a more direct way eventually took him in a very different direction professionally. He decided to study organizational development at the Case Western Business School, where he felt inspired by the opportunity to help organizations function more effectively. But as he began to work in this new arena, he soon found that his clarity about the importance of attending to the well-being of employees soon clashed with the desire of management to focus mainly on profits and the financial bottom line. This, too, was not going to be his deeper calling. In the mid-1980s, Frank decided to find work where he could focus his desire to be of service to others even more directly, and he became a high school math teacher. He worked in a wide range of settings that included the Hebrew Academy, Warrensville Heights High School, and Shaker Heights High School. While he definitely found a lot of fulfillment in this role, he began to realize that his skills and his commitment to make a difference in people's lives would be more effectively put to use in small group or one-on-one settings. This insight led him to a job that finally felt like it engaged him in all the ways he'd been looking for, and he became an intervention specialist at Shaker Heights High School. He did this work for quite a few years until his retirement in 2005, and he made a significant difference in the lives of the students he worked with. All of them thought he was the best. Frank's delight in and dedication to his own children very naturally extended to their life partners, Ali and Sarah, as they each became members of the family. But his most effusive joy emerged as grandchildren came into the picture. The arrival of Mona, and then Basma, and more recently Elijah, brought a richness to his life beyond anything he had ever experienced, and for which he was deeply grateful. Another expression of Frank's ever-flowing curiosity was his lifelong dedication to seeking truth and wisdom wherever he might find it. He didn't grow up in a particularly religious household, but during his teenage years, he once went to the library just so he could read the Sermon on the Mount, which remained an important text for him throughout his life. As a young and middle-aged adult, he was drawn to learning from organizations and spiritual teachers that encouraged people to notice and experience the depths and layers of meaning and perception, and not simply settle for the surface-level priorities that were so often served up by popular culture. He participated in workshops put on by organizations like the Gestalt Institute and EST, and he regularly read books written by the likes of Krishnamurti, Thich Nhat Hanh, and Sylvia Boorstein. He also kept a journal for the vast majority of his adult life, which served in a different way as a vehicle in his search for meaning through the prism of his own mind and heart. These attributes of his avid curiosity, his desire to understand ideas in great depth, were one of the central ways that I think Frank had an impact on our religious community of Kohellev. He often participated in adult education offerings, and he could always be counted on to ask in his typically low-key way the most penetrating and illuminating kinds of questions. He brought this same tenacious intellect to our community meetings and would always be one of the first in the room to raise awareness or concern over how a particular course of action might negatively impact any other members of our community. Frank's life, like every person's, had its complexities and its mysteries. He was a person of keen intelligence, with tremendous ability to relate to and be present for others, to make them feel safe and seen, whether it was his wife, his children and their families, his friends, his co-workers, or his fellow community members. And at the same time, for much of his adult life, he had struggles off and on with mental health, struggles that were likely connected with the difficulties he'd lived through as a child. Against that backdrop, his resilient commitment to and success at living his life with such clear Menschlichkeit as a solidly good and compassionate human being is all the more inspiring and perhaps even heroic. In retrospect, Frank's family feels that there were initial signs of cognitive decline as far back as a couple of decades ago, although it wouldn't be until years later that he was officially diagnosed with Lewy body dementia. But even as these new challenges gradually gained more prominence in his life, the core of who he was remained present and available to his loved ones. His emotional warmth, his caring deeply both for those he was closest to and for those he didn't know at all, his delight and pride in his children and grandchildren. However, his condition changed dramatically in December of 2023 after a terrible falling accident. He spent significant time in a rehab facility, but that was not able to overcome a steady deterioration in his mobility and his cognitive capacity. Within a fairly short period of time, he went from walking haltingly to using a walker to walking only very slowly with a walker, and then to requiring a wheelchair. And he was no longer able to be the person that his family and so many others had come to know and cherish. But surely, these last 2.5 years were just a footnote in the larger story of Frank's life. For Phyllis, Lisa, and David and their families, it was and is beyond evident that Frank had given them the very best of who he was, and that in doing so, he had made an indelible and life-affirming imprint, both on their own lives and on the world as well. That is his true and enduring legacy. Zichrono livracha. May his memory be for a blessing. I'd like to invite Lisa to come forward and share some reflections.
Anybody who knows me well knows that I can talk endlessly, so I wrote this down, and I'm going to try to read it fast, because even when I read it, it was still like 10 or 11 minutes, so, and what you said was beautiful, and you listened incredibly well, and I think you help people feel seen very much. So some of the stuff I'm going to say is now repeating a little bit because he really heard it, and he said some of the same stuff. But anyway, I wanted to talk to you today about the person I experienced my dad to be versus the person I suspect he was often internally, and what that's meant to me. I think some of this has been talked about here already, but I'd say my dad is very much somebody who people might say had a difficult childhood, and I'm not saying that to blame anybody. But just to say, if your father gets shot as a child and nobody thinks he's quite the same afterwards, and you has issues with what I believe years ago was called nervous anger, and your mother dies when you're 8, and your father has 4 kids, very much unprepared to take on the task of emotionally nurturing, or sometimes much less just managing even the basics of leading and running a family. And in his defense, I'll say he was also working full-time, and this was the 40s and the 50s, and he was a guy. But if that's the setup, and that meant that you lived in an orphanage for a while, and you saw a lot of kind of traumatic things before you were 8, and then at 8 your mom died, and no one actually helped clear some space for you to grieve or explained anything. And if you're maybe a very sort of self-contained, thoughtful person, temperamentally anyway, you take things upon yourself, and I think you perhaps take on a really high level of shame for things that weren't yours to be ashamed of. I mean, I remember him talking to me about feeling incredible levels of shame when he had to hang the clothes on the laundry line as a kid, which was women's work at the time, and he had to do that because he didn't have a mom. Somebody had to do it, but he was so aware of not having a mom, and this was like a source of shame. And I just imagine if that situation was a little more optimized for him or centered him as a hurting child a little bit more, he might have understood himself as a kid who had a real loss. We know that kids who lose a parent, sometimes even kids who are adopted or have parents who have addiction, or just a kid who loses a parent to heart and lung issues, as my dad did, often think they did something wrong. And that's why their mother, or in their child's mind, abandoned them. Or, as he was saying, you feel like you're all wrong just because you don't have a mom, which is what he was telling me about then. Like that itself was something he did wrong. In a more ideal situation, he would have other adults to take up the slack and maybe give him room to cry, and they might have explained to him, hey, you had a really hard thing happen. You're doing something great and helping to take care of your family by putting the clothes on the line. That's great. If people tease you about it, that's their problem, not yours, because you're doing something so helpful. This is a little thing, but I think there are any number of things my dad walked through life carrying shame about. And they weren't his shame to carry, but again, kids blame themselves often for all kinds of things. I think he also learned at a young age that he really shouldn't be too much because there weren't adults available to field him with his emotions, or even talk to him about things, because many of them were really struggling in their own ways, one way or another. And it's not your shame to carry if you don't have a parent to set up Thanksgiving dinner or celebrate Christmas, which were both things I remember him talking about. Not a lot. There's a story I remember him telling me about his older brother, who's just a couple years or so older than him. His name was David, and he had a different father. And I suspect inherited from him some street savvy that I don't think my dad had. He was a little bit of a hustler, even as a child. And my dad told me about how one Christmas he and David walked at like 10 or 11 at night, several miles down a snowy road to where the Christmas trees had been sold for the last month. And they went and took a tree because there wasn't going to be much demand anymore. So, and because maybe his brother was a little like that anyway. So they dragged the tree home and they had a Christmas tree. So how'd they have a Christmas tree? Well, they took it upon themselves because their father was not on it. And I'm not even sure he came home that evening. It was the evening Christmas Day. And again, my grandfather was struggling with his own demons. He always had a lot of that, but that left my dad and his siblings in a pretty vulnerable place. That memory, though, was a good memory for my dad. And I think it was partially possible also because my Uncle David, my dad's older brother, didn't have the tendency to blame himself or ruminate or walk around in shame, at least it's not as much that I know of. So it was a hard occasion that turned into a lark in my dad's memory. But, we have this thing, adverse childhood events, which are all the helping people in this room, and there's quite a number. Therapists, social workers, Rabbi Steve, the sort of things people know about now is a list of hard things that can happen to you as a child. And these events, which are parents' death, abuse, parent with mental health issues, etc., they've been correlated with, of course, having higher levels of mental health issues throughout life. Depending in part on how many of these adverse childhood events you had, they've been correlated with a lot of physical health issues too, because it turns out all this stuff takes a toll on your body. Which is not to say that these adverse events have to be some kind of prison sentence or that you can't, especially maybe if you pay and have the resources, the time, the energy to people in your life to pay some attention to doing some healing, that you can't still live an amazing life. But it means you start off handicapped, quite possibly to a great extent. And I think that was my dad. And I guess what I wanted to talk about that was that somehow my dad did not go on and on about this stuff, but I had some awareness of it. My dad was a guy who I think suffered quite a bit as a kid, and then both as a kid, but like as an adult, awful. He suffered some real torment, sometimes real anxiety. Later in life, lots of depression. He had treatment-resistant depression, so sometimes there was no way to kick it. So he spent his whole life that I know of working with it. And I think working under the impression that he could fix himself and that it was his job. And in fact, who else's job is it? We're all responsible for ourselves and our own emotions, so he wasn't totally wrong. But I think the way he went about his life, he was constantly struggling to find happiness in the middle of some really dark thoughts. Painful ruminating, self-blame. He pursued all kinds of self-help philosophy, religion, meditation. And by the way, this was like his own thing. He never proselytized, preached. This was what he was interested in for himself. So you heard about some of this from Rabbi Steve. He did yoga. He studied Buddhism. He went to just Gestalt therapy. I think his life in Judaism was very meaningful for him. He had therapy for many, many years, and he journaled endlessly. And he did cognitive behavioral therapy on himself. So he would identify his own cognitive distortions and then try to redirect himself. But I guess what I'm getting at is a picture for me is that there's the man my father was to all of us. Like we have the picture, me and my brother and my mom, I think his grandkids, my kids, our spouses, a lot of people got to experience the man he was, and many people speak to it. This very attentive, loving, compassionate, kind, gentle person who really could make a person feel seen, who would stop at nothing to make a person feel heard, valued, loved, understood. He showed up at my bedside if I was crying to be there for me, answered calls, and was about as perfect as you could be in terms of being supportive and compassionate and non-judgmental. And I just think I'm incredibly lucky for that. That is a massively unusual experience from when I talk to other people sometimes. I think many people who are in his orbit are incredibly lucky to also had him in their lives. I think what I wanted to sort of direct people's attention to, and I think Rabbi Steve already did this some, is if we're talking about memorializing my dad, though, is how much I think, and this, of course, is just my perspective, that he undertook this incredibly heroic thing. And some of it was just how he was built, but I think he dealt daily with these negative thoughts directed at himself, and really, truly kind of abusive thoughts sometimes directed at himself. And he kept it all inside, or most of it. I'm not saying we didn't know about it, but he blamed no one else, and our experience of him was very little of this kind of inner darkness. And I think it haunted him, but what we experienced was almost entirely someone who was incredibly present for other people. And for me, this is just an act of absolute heroism. I think it came out from what Rabbi Steve said again, too. This is a man who had a lot of modeling from his father that was kind of scary or angry. I think sometimes truly terrifying, and my dad had that inside of him. I think his siblings got a lot of that too. But by and large, for his entire life, he chose not to let it out. We were talking with Rabbi Steve, and David and I both said, can we remember maybe 2 times he was mad at us? Now, that also left a lot on my mom's plate. But he didn't raise his voice. And I said, this is Rabbi Steve, I think I remember 2 times, and one of them he was trying to quit smoking. So what this meant was that he had all this rough stuff inside of him, but by and large for his entire life he didn't let it out. He chose a different path, which meant that he was always the calmest person in the situation or the most understanding. And to me, this is like one of the most heroic things you can do with your life, to take a bunch of shit, which is nobody's fault, but it was shit, and turn it into gold, really. For the people in your life, absolute gold. And I'm not just saying this because he died. It's not just hyperbole. I'm saying that anybody who knows me well has heard this probably for the last 40 years of my life, which is that I think I was incredibly lucky to have this sort of person as my father. There's so many other good things we could say about him, how many things we all enjoyed in him or respected about him. But this thing I'm talking about now, that I'm so aware of him, is that he was this tremendous hero in his own life. And I don't know if he ever saw it that way, but I sure did. I was the beneficiary. I think his family was, people who knew him were. Family, friends, co-workers, the students he taught later in life, some of the people probably in Kol Halev. He took the absolute best of him, and that's what he gave to the rest of us. And you caught that line, but that's really what, no, but you were so right, and you are such a good listener. And he kept all the shit for himself. And a lot of it, that was just received experience that sucked. Perhaps like, it was also perhaps even the way, his mind really would have turned anyway, because there's probably some genetic tendency there, or here, it's possible. Kept all that inside, suffered with it, while the rest of us got this lovely, lovely guy. And I guess, yes, now that he's died, I kind of want to say, I think my dad was a hero, and I feel so lucky, and I think so many of us have been, to have known him, and I'm so glad that I get to carry this guy around inside of me for the rest of my life. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for an incredibly moving sharing about your dad. We are going to transition towards the conclusion of the ceremony. We are going to do that with the recitation of the 23rd Psalm, and we're going to use the traditional language, the traditional English language translations, so please feel free to join me if you would like to. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. For those who are comfortable doing so, I'm going to invite you to rise for the chanting of the memorial prayer. And if you're not comfortable, please feel free to stay seated. El malei rachamim shochen bamromim hamsei menucha nechona tachat kanfei hashchina b'ma'alot kedoshim utehorim kizohar harakia mazhirim et nishmat Frank, the son of Walter and Nancy, shehalach leolamo. Ahana bal harachamim, hastirehu beseter kenafecha leolamim, utzror bitzror hachayim, et nishmato. Adonai hu nachalato, v'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo, v'nomar Amen. Divine source of mercy, dwelling in the heavens heights and the depths of our hearts, bring proper rest beneath the wings of your divine presence, amid the ranks of the holy and the pure, illuminating like the brilliance of the skies the soul of Frank Maris, who has gone to his eternal place of rest. May you who are the source of mercy shelter him beneath your wings eternally, and bind his soul among the living, that he may rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. We are going to continue with the Mourner's Kaddish. If anyone, I have a few cards, and I think Michael has some too. If anyone would like Hebrew and or transliteration. Let's see. Okay. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah be'alma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala v'zman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabbah mevarach la'alam u'la'almei almaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitale v'yithalal shmei dekudsha barichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. May the one who makes peace in the heavens make peace for us, for all Israel, and for all who dwell on earth, and bring comfort and healing to the hearts of all those who are in mourning. And let us say, Amen. Please be seated. I want to remind everyone that immediately following the conclusion of today's service, the family will be receiving friends at the Greenbrier apartment building at 17,100 Van Aken Boulevard. That will kind of begin as the family makes their way back there, but I want to say that at 4 o'clock in that room there will be a little bit more of a structured opportunity if there are people who would like to share their own memories and stories about Frank. So does that sound right? Okay. And so that'll be at 4. And also I want to underscore that it's the preference of the family that if you want to contribute in memory of Frank, you should just do so through the charity of your choice. To conclude, may all who mourn find comfort. May all who fall beneath sorrow's burden find the strength to rise and to walk on. Let us grant each other peace. Let us give each other courage. Let us spread out a blanket of peace that we might aid in each other's healing. Let us say, Amen. That concludes the formal part of today's ceremony. Thank you. Yeah, good.
Thank you. No, what you said was wonderful, and it was great. That must
Thank you
have been 20
for
pages of notes, literally.
thank you for giving me all that, perspective.
Are you going to come on over? Or? Okay. Well, good to see you briefly.
Yes.
Barely. Oh, yeah, no, I have the same problem.